Seattle is so short-staffed on everything that they send out one medical examiner. The medical examiner said, "You may not want to watch this." And he put my son's body in a bag and literally dragged him down 3 sets of concrete stairs.
What kind of afterthoughts does it send through your head? Like, how does it make you see the world, think about parenting, think about our time here?
So 1-year anniversary, brutal, just brought me down. But then you've got Father's Day and oh yeah, half of my children are dead. A city like Seattle hands them everything in the world to continue that addiction. These people are not in a mental place where they can barely communicate.
What were kind of some of the things you tried with him and what worked and what didn't work? And can we extrapolate from that how we should then treat people on the street? All right, so we are joined today by Sean Reynolds, host of the podcast news show, News for Reasonable People. So before we get into things we want to talk about, Sean, can you tell me a little bit about, what you do, how you got to this place?
Sure, yeah. So I spent most of my adulthood as a real estate appraiser. I bought the company from an existing owner at a young age. I started up a real estate brokerage in my 20s. I've been doing real estate, both appraisal and the brokerage for years and years and years. Started doing more video to promote Summit Properties Northwest, one of my companies. And then we had Chop and Chaz here in Seattle, and I had just a ton of viewership from that. And we kind of morphed from the Seattle Real Estate Podcast into what we know now as News for Reasonable People. So that in kind of a nutshell is how we got from real estate guy to now pretty much full-time podcaster, even though I am still managing 2 real estate companies.
Podcast is now the more full-time thing because you've amassed over 100,000 followers. They're expecting you to post.
Yeah.
You post multiple times a week.
A day,
multiple times a day. And you're conservative leaning, right?
Yeah. And we talked earlier, and I just don't view myself as conservative.
What do you view yourself as?
I don't know. Normal?
Reasonable?
Reasonable. Regular.
But it's fair to say that your viewer base is, they would probably identify as conservative.
Well, what used to be, middle of the road is now far right. Mm-hmm. And everything has moved so hard to the left that it's left a lot of us that, kind of think, well, what am I? I would say right of center is what I would call myself, but definitely more conservative than liberal.
So you're saying what used to be viewed as center right, like, I don't know, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, whatever, people view it's so, society's moved so far left that they view that as far right?
Far right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And living and grown up in Seattle, grew up in Bellevue, it didn't used to be a big issue, but now Seattle has become so, a certain aspect of it has become so far left.
Well, Seattle's always, it's had grunge. It's always been kind of counterculture, but you think that's even changed more so? It's shifted more so?
Wildly.
Yeah.
Wildly. I've been appraising here, so I've been through all these neighborhoods, King County, Snohomish County, Pierce County, for years and years and years, literally over 30 years I've been driving around. So I've kind of known these neighborhoods. And at some point in time, Seattle just took a hard left. Or that group. Capitol Hill's always been here. Capitol Hill's always had that kind of alternative. But now it feels like that alternative runs things. And we definitely have had more in the city council. And, we've had some situations where politically, it's mind-blowing that in a big city like Seattle that we had CHOP, where we we abandoned a police station. Mm-hmm. When do we do that?
And what do you think caused that hard left turn, as you call it?
What caused it? It's ideology, right? I think something, somebody else thinks something else different. They're labeled one thing, I'm labeled one thing. I don't know what's behind all this. But it's been a definite change. You've kind of got breakdown of all kinds of different things going on. The crazy stuff that we had at the beginning of the Olympics this year. It's like, what are we doing here? What direction are we going here?
Do you think that the country as a whole, kind of the virtue signaling of our politics has just moved, gravitated more left, and Seattle's always been counterculture, so it and Portland are just naturally going to be at the spearhead of that?
Yeah, I think the West Coast, it's always been kind of alternative, right? I mean, you mentioned grunge. That's a great example. I mean, the guys with the beanies and, the plaid and just angsty and, upset about everything and just screaming into a mic. But some amazing music came out of that as well.
Right.
So Seattle's got some great things. I mean, geography here is amazing. But what has come out of this push to the far left has been, you got a bunch of crime going on. You got a bunch of homelessness. You got a drug scenario that, basically took the life of my son. He lived not far from where we're sitting and overdosed on an accidental, overdose of fentanyl. So you've got situations like that aren't necessarily happening across the country to the extent that they are here. And I think a lot of that has to do with the political leanings of being right here.
Yeah, so I was going to ask some of the things you talk about on your show, but you kind of just listed them all out there. And I was going to also bring up that you're not just a talking head who's kind of building on some sort of political opportunism. This is very personal for you. And whatever anyone wants to say about your views, you kind of have a very strong emotional right to them. I know you approach things rationally. You viewed things a certain way before this tragedy happened, but can you talk a little bit about how everything unfolded with your son? Someone like yourself who is so aware of these issues, and yet it struck home for you.
Well, my son struggled with addiction. He went through multiple rehabs. He was 27 when he passed away. So there were struggles, and he had struggled, before that. But he'd kind of gotten things squared away. And then he got to a point in his relationship with his girlfriend where she was like, all right, we need to see other people. And so he took a Xanax pill. He took what he thought was a Xanax. And it ended up, we think, because we don't actually know. So on my son's death certificate, it says natural causes, which essentially means he didn't die from being murdered and he didn't die from suicide. Leaves a whole plethora of things wide open, but he had a batch of Xanax on him, and this was February of 23, and the city was going through a massive epidemic of overdoses. So we're left with he overdosed. I mean, he didn't have a heart attack, he didn't have a stroke, any of that kind of stuff. So drugs essentially kind of took him, took his life.
And the toxicology, it wasn't conclusive?
Wasn't conclusive. So there wasn't enough fentanyl in his system. He died. He died probably on a Saturday night. We didn't find him until a Tuesday morning. And so he was dead for quite some time. His body was decomposing. It basically metabolized whatever drugs he had in his system that killed him. So we don't know. So it's a horrible way to live as a parent. You don't really know. But he had a batch of Xanax on him. So, I mean, and, Xanax being a drug that they cut with fentanyl. And that's something I talk about a lot is the wide open southern border. This is a direct result of that, of the current last 3.5 years of immigration policy has left, 100,000 people a year dying from overdoses, and a lot of those are from fentanyl that gets manufactured in China, sent to Mexico, comes up through the wide open southern border. So I could be real upset about that, but then again, there's something in me that says, yeah, but my son made choices that other parents' kids aren't. My kid just paid, the ultimate price for taking a Xanax bar that was laced with fentanyl.
So a couple of things there. So you don't know for sure that it's fentanyl, but you kind of, based on the information you research and know about, you're saying you kind of infer it was.
He was 27. He was, he had no major health issues. He didn't die of a disease. He didn't die of a heart attack. He didn't die of a stroke. He had a bunch of he had 175 or 150 Xanax bars on him. He didn't die of an overdose of Xanax. So what does that, he had no blunt trauma. He had nothing to indicate that he died of anything, weird. So we're kind of left with not knowing. So you put the pieces of the puzzle together and you go with,
You said he had a break and then kind of relapsed after the breakup. But when he was, actively addicted.
Yeah, he was addicted to fentanyl. We didn't know that. And this was in 2019 when he was quite a bit younger. And then he went through rehab. He kind of got things in order. And then before he died, a few months before he died, I think he started taking Xanax or something just to kind of calm him down. He was on something. I knew it. His mom knew it. And so we knew he was on something, but it wasn't fentanyl. Because when somebobody's on fentanyl. I mean, it's a nasty, nasty drug. And when somebody's, on that. And he was not on that. So he literally was not doing fentanyl when he died. And so his tolerance for fentanyl was, he didn't have any. So he took a pill that was probably laced, and you only need 2 milligrams of fentanyl in whatever you're taking, and it can kill you.
Right, because you're saying he hadn't done it for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so do you know how he got addicted in the first place years ago?
He was a party guy. He loved to have a good time. Certain kids take pills, other kids smoke weed, other kids drink, whatever it might be. I think pills were kind of one of his things. So he literally, I think he was with his girlfriend for a number of days. She said, hey, maybe you should go home and just, check out things at home and see what's going on there. He had a cat. And he went home, he probably took a pill and he died, and we didn't know about it for a handful of days. And then I got the call, I needed to call my ex-wife, his mom, and I had to run from the office. I had just finished a live stream, and I saw all this commotion through my door at the office, like all these people kind of pacing outside the door. I have one of those kind of translucent doors. And all these people were, all this commotion. And I opened up the door after the live stream, recording a live stream. And you need to call Monica, his mom. And he had passed away. So I had to run from Bellevue, not far from here, and meet up with the King County medical examiner, meet up with the police, meet up with the pet department. They took his cat. Yeah. And
what was your mental state like throughout this process from the second, you kind of found out, was it kind of expected? Were you in shock? Were you emotional? What was it like for you?
Massive shock. I think you're in shock for like a year and a half. I think his death didn't really hit me until the 1-year anniversary of his death, which was February, call it 20th. And then shortly after that is Father's Day. So I had the 1-year anniversary, and what happened on the 1-year anniversary is that he died. Everybody else knows he died, but they don't want to bring it up with you because they figure you're grieving and, we already did all that. Hey, I'm so sorry if there's anything I can do to help you out. We've passed that, a year ago. And so you kind of feel like you're just out there on your own as a parent, because all of a sudden nobody really cares about your kid anymore. And it's not that they don't, it's just, it's so awkward. Hey, your son died a year ago. How's that going? Mm-hmm. Having that conversation, you just don't have it anymore. So 1-year anniversary, brutal, just brought me down, severe depression. And then the Father's Day, I've still got my Brennan had an older brother, Kiernan, and Kiernan's still around. And I work with Kiernan, and, I love Kiernan to death. But then you've got Father's Day, and half of my children are dead. So working through that has been just very difficult. So I don't think you even recognize that your kid is really dead. One of the startling things I remember from that day, and I shot a lot of footage because I knew that my ex-wife wouldn't be able to come down and kind of see his body go off. But one of the things that really struck me was the medical examiner. Seattle is so short-staffed on everything that they send out one medical examiner. And this is a steep site on Dexter, and he was on the 3rd floor. And so they had to bring his body down to the hearse, or whatever you call it, the van where they put bodies. And so the medical examiner said, "You may not want to watch this." And he put my son's body in a bag and literally dragged him down 3 sets of concrete stairs.
Is he allowed to do that?
Well, that's how he had to get the body down.
They couldn't have like 2 people just...
Don't have the manpower.
It's crazy.
So I watched my son's body, and in that moment, I remember watching my son's body get dragged down, and I'm thinking, God, they're really hurting him. They're really reefing on his body. And then I remember thinking, he's dead. They can't do anything more to him. And it was just, and you know, this is an hour, 2 hours after kind of going to the scene, his apartment. And it was just one of those, good Lord, he is dead. And you don't take care of a dead body the same way you would as somebody who's still alive.
Isn't it, you know, desecrational to some extent, even if you're not religious? Like, don't you have a responsibility to kind of honor the body?
My son was 245, big kid, 6 foot, 245. The medical examiner was not big. So what's he going to do?
I'm saying, you know, like, I don't know.
In theory, yes. In reality, in Seattle, there were so many people ODing at the time, and there still are.
Yeah.
That it's
no another day for them.
It's another day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Horrific.
Yeah. So, and were you close with Brennan?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He lived with me. I mean, he lived with me. He was supposed to live with his mom. He lived with me most of high school, a lot of high school, on and off. His mom and I got him through rehab. It had been a struggle for about 10 years, and he seemed like he kind of had things together. But then I honestly believe he had no intention of killing himself, and he died of an accidental overdose of fentanyl, because the Mexican cartel is lacing all the drugs that we now take with fentanyl because it's cheaper and it's a way better high and it's easy to get. And with a wide open southern border the way it was, you know, up until about December of 23, drugs are just pouring across the border. And we know that by the number of busts and the number of people dying here. And it's just, you know, it's kind of just reality.
So I'll get to the political aspect of it in a little, but I want to ask, do you think that you have kind of an addictive gene or an addictive family history, or do you think that your son got caught by something that literally anyone could get caught by if they party? We've
got so many members in my family that have either been alcoholic, drug addict, rehab. Yeah, for sure. It is absolutely. And on my ex-wife's side as well. Yeah, it's genetic for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, if you look back far enough, everybody's got like that uncle who's, you know, tips a little bit too much. But in my family, I mean, you look at your grandparents, my siblings, extended family members. We are not teetotalers. Let's just say that.
Well, it's strange because knowing you seem, I would say, like rather stable. Like you're not like a neurotic. You don't seem compulsive. You know, your show is news for reasonable people. You know.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear you say that. I guess it's kind of, the gene is a gene. You know.
Yeah. I have a younger brother who went through multiple rehabs. My parents moved to Texas because of his addiction. And he has battled that his whole entire adult life. So you've got, you know, me and a younger brother. We couldn't be more different as far as that goes. Right. So, you know, one's extreme, one is more moderate. That's the luck of the draw. And that same thing with Brennan, my son that died, his older brother, Kiernan. Wildly different. And so genetics.
Does something so catastrophic in your life, you what kind of afterthoughts does it send through your head? Like, does it make you question what things you could have done differently? Like, how does it make you see the world, think about parenting, think about our time here, anything in that realm?
Yeah, crazy thoughts, initially, and I still think this, and it's so selfish, is I should have had more kids. If I would have had 3 kids, I'd still have 2.
Right.
Horrible stuff that goes through your head. Just crazy stuff like that. Because when you lose a kid, my son will forever be 27. And I've talked about 27 for years, the 27 Club.
Yeah. Kurt Cobain,
Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison.
Yeah.
The list just goes on and on and on. And I think what it is your body gets to a certain point and you can either handle it or you can't.
Yeah.
And so, I think that wasn't necessarily my son's deal. But then again, it ended up being that because maybe he got sober for a while. And most addicts die. Most folks here in Seattle die when they come clean, they go back out, they take the same dose, and their body can't handle it, and boom, they're done. That's when people die. That's when people overdose. Because all the other addicts are asking, literally, where did that dude get that fetty? Because that's what I want. That's the strong stuff. Because they figure their body is able to take it. So, yeah, it's a wacky world we live in. What was the question again?
Just about, I think you kind of gave a version of an answer in the sense of, I asked, what are the afterthoughts going through something so traumatic like this? Do you think that there is anything you could have done differently in raising him? Not that I think you should feel guilty or anything like that. I'm just curious, maybe you could offer insight for other parents, or is it just kind of a thing of you just got really unlucky?
My son was 27. He was not 15. He made decisions. He made choices. We helped him get through multiple rehabs or help him detox. My ex-wife had helped him detox, I think, a few times at her house. And if you've never dealt with somebody detoxing from either heroin or fentanyl or whatever, it is a horrific process because their bodies are so addicted to that stuff. And that's why these drugs work, because people get hooked on them and they're just off to the races. So as far as things we could have done, I don't beat myself up for that.
Maybe
I really don't. Yeah.
That's good.
Because it just doesn't do me any good.
Yeah.
I'm sad about it, but there's nothing else I could have done. And towards the end of his life, people had started kind of distancing themselves from him because I think folks know that he was on something and I had confronted him. And for him, that was a real slippery slope. And it ended up killing him.
Yeah. Yeah, I ask it from like a practical perspective, obviously not a guilting one, just because for me, and I think for everyone, it's so scary, the idea that you don't have control over certain things, that you could do everything in your power. And there are probably so many stories, people watching as well, who, what did I do wrong with my kid? Like I gave them everything they could have wanted. I didn't overspoil them, but I provided for them, like I raised them in the right way, and it still can happen. Yeah. And I think for me, that's a scary thought. If I have kids one day, that at a certain point, you just can't control their actions anymore.
No. My son grew up very privileged by most standards. He went to Bellevue High School. He lived on Hunts Point. He lived in Medina. I mean, this is not a kid from, back in the day we used to say, he's not a kid from the Bronx. And that reference. He used to be rough. But he was not a kid from South Seattle. He had everything that somebody could want, and he lacked for nothing. But, set of life circumstances and decisions he made took his life.
There's this movie called Beautiful Boy, which I think is based on a memoir or a book, which deals with a kid from an affluent background who just gets hooked on meth. It's with Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet. And
I've heard of that.
Yeah. Similar kind of story of like, they gave him everything, right? And it still happened. Do you think there's an aspect, because I hear a lot of stories about people from affluent backgrounds ending up on the streets. Do you think there's an aspect of people are kind of searching for conflict or searching for meaning in some way? They're kind of bored with their life, or they have a lack of purpose?
Yeah, and they get into drugs because it's something fun to do. And then the drugs that are out there now are so addictive, they can't get off them. And you'll see examples of people being interviewed all the time. I watch a lot of homeless interviews just to kind of keep a tab on what's going on out there.
Soft white underbelly.
Yeah, soft white underbelly is a great example. Although, man, some of that stuff is just so gut-wrenching that you just can't, you watch it like this, right? It's so hardcore, especially for me. So now I watch all these people, I'm like, that dude is totally whacked out on drugs, but he's still alive, and my son's dead. My son sits in an urn in my ex-wife's, closet. So how's that fair? How does that work? So those are some of the things that go through my head. And then just getting through the depression that I've had, because, I have major empathy for a lot of people now that are homeless, because there's usually some major event in their life that got them to go down this road of drugs or to accelerate that use of drugs. And then they just kind of give up on themselves and they give up on their lives. Something happens, somebody dies. And so I identify with that now because I've never had depression before, never. And I've experienced that pretty heavily the last probably 6 months. Yeah, probably 6 months. And I feel like I'm kind of just getting through some of that now. But it's so debilitating. But would I go to drugs? No, because that's kind of where we started. And
yeah, vicious cycle.
Yeah, vicious cycle.
No, certainly, like the people on the street, a lot of people, myself included, I think you have a gut reaction sometimes of judgment of like, oh, you're irresponsible, and perhaps they made an irresponsible choice to begin with, but once the drugs get a hold of you, I mean, that is beyond, I don't want to say this for recovering addicts, but at a certain point, your mind is just not even in a place to decide,
no,
oh, I want to do this or I don't.
Right. Yeah.
You're possessed by it in a way.
Yeah. And that is where the whole harm prevention, harm reduction is just absolutely effed. And that is a concept of, we want to help these people, but they've got to make the choice. These people are not in a mental place where they can barely communicate. They are like animals now. Mm-hmm. And so a city like Seattle hands them everything in the world to continue that addiction. And that's some of what, Andrea Suarez works with of We Heart Seattle. That's why I'm a big believer in her program, which is getting people into treatment, because housing is treatment. Treatment is housing. Mm-hmm. It gets a roof over their head. And the whole notion of, well, if we can just get them into housing, now they're doing drugs on their own and they're dying in their own little tiny home at record numbers because there's nobody around in the encampment to give them some Narcan to pop them out of their fentanyl overdose.
Yeah, you're going down a road talking about housing that I want to get to, but, before we go there, I wanted to bring up something I remember, I think you said on your podcast after Brennan passed, you said like the one, I guess, silver lining or thing you were thankful for in all this, tragedy was that he didn't die in a tent, that he died in his apartment. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
To have your son die in a tent and maybe they find his body 3 or 4 days later. He died in a very nice apartment with huge views, kind of overlooking where my boat is. So I look up on the hillside and it's one of those spots, just a beautiful spot. It's actually looking up this direction. And I am so thankful that I can identify that my son passed away at that point instead of a tent somewhere around here in Seattle in a gutter, just hardcore. How did your son pass away? Well, they found him in a tent. His body was decomposed. Knowing there's just something about that notion of he died, he didn't mean to die, but at least he died in an environment there wasn't like so many of the people in Seattle or Portland or San Francisco that die, in the streets.
I don't remember it verbatim, but I remember you kind of, in a way, pleading to parents out there who are parents of addicts of, even if you can't fix your kid's addiction, get them out of a tent, get them in somewhere, I guess, respectable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get them somewhere. But you know what? When your kid's 27, he makes his own decisions.
Right.
So my son was in a nice apartment, and I'm real thankful for that. That is, I wouldn't know. I don't know if I'd call it a silver lining, but it was one of those things that, all right, everything else here is just terrible, but that part of the equation, okay, at least we got that. So when I think of when I ride a jet ski or ride and take my boat out, and I look up at where Brendan passed away from, it's a beautiful area.
Right.
And I'm thankful for that.
There's something poetic and heavenly that you're looking.
You think about him going, whatever
angelic.
you believe,
Yeah.
his spirit ascended,
Yeah.
Whatever that was. His spirit had left his body that got dragged down, 3 flights of concrete steps, just this horrific notion of he's no longer there. The whole thing is just wildly messed up.
Mm-hmm. And so you say you've been dealing with depression since, which obviously makes sense.
Yeah.
Have you been getting help for that, or is that something you're dealing with on your own? How do you think you can work your way through that?
Yeah. So what I've been doing is I've been doing grief gardening. So I went absolutely ham on the gardening the last 2 years. I mean, I've got, I think, 28 pumpkin plants going. I've got all kinds of vegetables. I've got all kinds of stuff. So I put myself into that. I put myself into my podcasting. I keep myself super busy because it's when the wheels start to slow down that this isn't going to go well. I'm not a huge fan of traditional grief counseling. And a lot of that has to do with folks want to put you on antidepressants. And there are so many examples of, and they'll tell you right on the bottle, hey, if you can get through the first couple of months of these antidepressants, you're golden. But your odds of taking your own life in the first couple of months, you enter a new cycle of antidepressants, your odds of committing suicide are astronomical. Yeah. And especially in mid-aged men. And you see it in, there's a bunch of rock stars out there. Chris Cornell, good example. But, he had all kinds of other stuff going on. But, stuff like that in my head is, I'm like, I don't really want to do the antidepressants. What can I do to keep busy and kind of work my way through? Because I really think the antidepressants are there so that you can buy yourself some time, work out what you think, and then, continue your life, whatever that might look like.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to go the psychiatric route, just someone to talk to,
Yeah. And you know what? I don't have a problem talking about it.
Yeah.
I've talked, I think we found my son on a Tuesday. I think the following Monday, I went in and ripped a 45-minute video on my son's death because I wanted to have that out there. This is raw. This is what we're doing. This is what it feels like to lose a kid to drugs. And so, that's on my channel, and I wanted to record that. And so I've been talking about it. I talk about it probably as much as anybody.
And it is nice that, where you're lucky in this situation is that you have this podcast, so you have this community of, up to 100,000 people, give or take, and that know your story and are behind you and probably will share their story in the comment section. Yeah.
And I've got a lot of viewers that's their story too. They lost a kid.
Yeah.
I've got all these names that I know. I don't know their, on YouTube, everybody's anonymous.
Yeah.
So I've got all these people that I'm like, I wonder what their real name is. I wonder what they look like, because everything's so wonky on YouTube.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of people out there that are in the same boat. There's a lot of people hurting. That's what grunge is all about in Seattle, is people hurting.
Yeah.
That's the bottom essence. You think about all those guys, they were all depressed doing heroin.
Right. It's just Kurt Cobain and a couple others happened to become millionaires off their pain.
Yeah.
But the people who didn't make it, they could be on the street right now.
Yeah.
We have no idea.
No idea.
Yeah.
And there's so many of them. That whole genre, I mean, Eddie Vedder is one of the few that's left.
Right.
You know, I mean, the rest of them are all dead. And some of them, you know, Chris Cornell died at 52, took his own life. You know, so sad.
There's a lot of controversy about that. I think his wife, I don't want to speak too much without knowing enough, but I think his wife thinks that he didn't do it. That it was like
I have read that as well.
right, medical prescription or something like that.
Yeah.
But either way, he was in that sphere of
Yeah.
drugs and
Right.
all that where it's plausible.
Yeah. And I mean, I have actually listened to a lot of his music. And he talks about a lot of stuff that is pretty hardcore. I mean,
sure.
It's some wild stuff. But that's also kind of what makes him so unique.
Exactly. You know, for some people, it can be a therapeutic outlet, and some people it bleeds over just into their real life and they can't escape it. The music, I'm saying.
Right.
The music
Yeah.
is not just an outlet, but a reflection of what they're going through.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, another example is Lane Staley
Right. Of
from Alice in Chains.
Alice in Chains, yeah.
The way he can sing and what he's singing about, I mean, are just mind-blowing. Especially if you're dealing with some pretty sad stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, crazy.
Yeah. That's the thing is, even though music, you know, the Seattle in the 90s was counterculture, I think what's different now about the political movements, they're very online and they're very kind of abstract intellectualism. They don't feel as much connected to humanity. Because even if you don't agree with Kurt Cobain or Eddie Vedder's politics, you still feel the humanity in their music. There's something that I think almost anyone can relate to.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? That's some of what I struggle with now is that I'm very aware of politics.
Yeah.
So there are artists that I used to enjoy very much, and I no longer can say I really dig their music.
Oh, trust me, I relate every week. You know, someone, I don't want to make it about me, but someone new comes out and says something anti-Semitic or something.
Yeah. Oh.
Right? It's just, it's like, all right, we lost
what?
that person.
Yeah, let's check them off my list.
Not that I really ever cared about this person, but just to mention another Seattleite, Macklemore, you know, he's really just committed to his white guilt redemption tour.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, look, you obviously had people like John Lennon who were political. Kurt Cobain was very political, coming on stage on MTV in a dress saying God is gay, things like that. But there was a kind of badass nature to it. They were doing it in a time when other people weren't doing it, when it wasn't a virtue signal.
It was a real statement.
Yeah.
A real statement.
And the other thing is people could get along because you look at Chris Novoselic, the bassist.
Yep.
He's a conservative. He's like a conservative politician now.
He's trying to get his own party together.
Right.
Yeah.
He's part of, I think, actually Andrew Yang's Freedom Party. I think he joined it. Yeah.
All right. And he's a supporter of Andrea Suarez.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. You know, he was going to be at a Christmas party that I didn't make it to because my head was too spun. But yeah, there's plenty of examples of people that you're like, oh, hey, you're reasonable too. That's
right.
weird.
And you were in Nirvana, like in Seattle in the 90s.
Even in Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think some of what my audience, they want their ideology of all West Coast cities have gone to hell. Mm-hmm. They are done. You know, they're destroyed because of liberal politics, because of Democrat politics. Some of that, yes, you can say, is true. The politics have created situations like homelessness and crime. That has been the case. But what my audience also doesn't understand is there's some amazing things about Seattle. The geography.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know, there's some crazy fun stuff to do here. So it's not all bad, but my audience wants their idea of Seattle has gone to hell. I won't ever go there again. I'll leave all the cities alone.
Right.
They want to have that justified. So when people are doing fun stuff and people are visiting Seattle, that doesn't coincide with their ideas.
Yeah, for sure. It's, you know, very honest that you bring that up, you know, because it is your audience. But I think it's just the online space in general is such a negative echo chamber that no matter your views, people are just going to be kind of compiling the worst parts of their imagination of a place or a thing. And yes, Seattle has a lot of problems. The West Coast has a lot of problems, but it's arguably the most beautiful city in America.
Summer in Seattle,
It's incredible.
you can't beat it.
You're surrounded by water, multiple lakes, wherever you go, views of Rainier, breweries. It's just it's a great place to be. There's this YouTuber, you might know him, World According to Briggs, I think his name is. He's like kind of one of these goes to every state type guy.
Okay.
I think he lives in Vancouver, Washington, if I'm not mistaken. But he said something like, you know, Seattle, the homelessness, it's so expensive, like things that have kernels of truth. But he's like, you can't get an apartment for under $2,000 without stepping over a homeless person. And this is 1650. You know, so I do think the internet has kernels of truth, but if you spend too much time on there, you're not living in reality fully. Like you need to kind of touch grass sometimes.
Yeah. And if you only subscribe to people that have one ideology of how things are going, you know, you're in your own echo chamber, and that's not good. So I watch a lot of different stuff from a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives. Because if you don't know what the other guy's perspective is, how can you kind of have your own that is objective?
And I think the problem we're seeing on the far left and a lot of people in Seattle is they're not thinking that way. I think being closer to the center, you listen to a multitude of different voices, like what you just said. But I was at a cafe recently in Seattle, and these two people who are clearly on the far left were literally getting in a fight because one sent them a clip they disagreed with. You know, I think it was about either pro or anti Kamala Harris. Forget what and it's crazy to me. It's crazy that, you know, like I consider myself a liberal. You consider yourself center right.
Conservative by today's standards. Yeah.
Right. We still have the same vision of pretty much the world we want to live in. You know, what makes a neighborhood nice?
Right.
What's a good quality of life?
Right.
And it seems the extremes are kind of divided on what that looks like.
And that is so much of why I started podcasting, is because it's easier to sell a home that's in a decent neighborhood that isn't rocked by homelessness, that isn't rocked by crime, that isn't graffitied up. It's easier to sell those homes because it's a nicer neighborhood. And I've seen so much of Seattle go down this. Seattle's always been grungy. I mean, it's always been grungy.
U District, you said?
U District, yeah.
When you were there?
When I went to school there, yeah, in the late 80s, early 90s. And then in the 90s, I mean, grunge took over, and it's like that, it's so cool. You know, everybody's poor and doing drugs and screaming about this and that. But then I think you kind of get past that and you realize there's some stuff here that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, I think those things were kind of cool when they were not the norm. But now that it's kind of like we're in a high school and the popular kids are just the ones who do the anti-normal thing, right? Like whatever it is, I'm not going to get too much into it.
Yeah.
But everyone is quirky. Everyone is topsy-turvy, right? That's when it becomes a problem. It's one thing when it's like, hey, let's accept that kid who dresses differently.
Right.
But then it's another thing when everyone is like that and actually I'm dressed heteronormatively and kind of judged for it.
Or when that kid is pressing his ideal that you should wear a dress.
Right.
And you're a boy.
Right. And I'm a cis white, whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever the terms are.
I think some of what we're seeing right now in politics in Seattle is that pullback from that push from the far left. You've got Sarah Nelson. She won't call herself conservative, but she, owner of Fremont Brewing.
Right.
She's reasonable. You've got the Seattle city attorney is reasonable. You've got a number of people on the city council that have replaced a lot of very far left. Shama Sawant was very far left. I mean, she's straight up socialist. And she decided not to run. And so you've got a more reasonable crew of folks running Seattle now. And you've got a reasonable mayor. I mean, by Seattle standards, he's Bruce Harrell.
Bruce, yeah.
Yeah, Bruce Harrell. I mean, he's pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
So there's been a shift.
Let's get into that. Let's get into a little bit of the politics. Before we get into some stuff we might disagree on, I want to tell you kind of where I'm more with you, and things that really make me upset, and hopefully get some clarity from you on it. A lot of people on the left, particularly the far left, will look at the people on the street and they'll say, this is just a housing issue. This is just because, things are too expensive. It's all economic. And yes, there's obviously a housing element to it, but they will do this at the expense without admitting that there's a massive drug problem that's influencing it, that you have people who come from all the opportunity in the world, and I'm not shaming them, but reality, and they end up on the street because living in an apartment complex, living in a home doesn't fit their lifestyle. They're spending all their money on drugs. And I don't say this for talking points. I say this because I hate when people deny reality, especially when people's lives are at stake. You walk around the street, you do not see like a guy who looks like he was working a job yesterday and the next day he's like, oh, I ran out of money, I'm homeless now.
Yeah.
No, you look at people who this is their lifestyle. This is who they plan to be for the rest of their lives. So I guess my question out of that is, why do you think people are so in denial of that? Why do you think people can't just admit that a huge element of the homelessness crisis is drugs and mental health, rather than just, oh, I got priced out of my apartment and now I'm on the street and I didn't have a backup plan?
Right. I think it's so much easier to blame housing. It's so much easier to blame housing. Housing's expensive on the West Coast. If you have a job that doesn't allow you to afford whatever, and I know we've had some massive inflation in recent years, and that's exacerbated the whole deal. And then we had interest rates go through the roof. So now you got expensive homes on top of high interest rates with your mortgage payments. Nobody can afford a home. But that has been a known quantity for a while. And I don't think that dictates whether somebody's homeless or not. Affordability is not a factor. It's they at some point are making a conscious choice to accept homelessness. In cities like Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, they completely enable that lifestyle. Hey, you cold? We'll get you a blanket. Hey, you need a tent? Here's two. Hey, you need some food? We'll throw you a banana. You can go down here, you can get free food. You can get anything you want in Seattle. And people come here. So it's been that pull for people to come here and do drugs. And then the folks that don't want to really admit that, they blame it on housing.
The way I divide the right and the left ideologically is the hard right believes everything is your responsibility, and the hard left believes everything is someone else's fault. It can't be your fault.
Yeah. I
personally am a proponent of it's probably mostly your responsibility, but we should still be compassionate and try to give people a hand. But I just can't understand why people would be in denial of what's right in front of our eyes. I mean, you see it on the street around you.
We've created this scenario. Harm reduction doesn't work. We know that. But the alternative to that is putting people involuntarily into mental health care, putting people involuntarily into treatment, maybe detox, getting them through a 90-day program. And we're not at a place in society where we're doing that. Everybody watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and thought that all the doctors are just raping all the patients. So we got to empty out all the mental institutions, which we have effectively done. And that was bipartisan. That was both Republicans and Democrats. We just, as a society, went, no, can't have that anymore. That's horrible. And that was horrible. But the flip side is you don't have enough places for people to go with mental issues. And so many of the people you see in the homeless encampments are screaming at the clouds. They're screaming at a tree. They're running around naked, because they don't realize they don't have clothes on. They need mental health care. They need treatment. But that would require us as a society to do something a little bit more conservative and actually put them in care. And the far left wants us to believe that, people should be able to do whatever they want. And when they want to choose treatment, they can and they will. But most of these folks that are hardcore, they're going to die on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to make it.
And when you say that the far left wants this, right, the situation now, it's not an exaggeration in the sense we've seen. You could obviously come up with theories about some homeless industrial complex, but we've seen with our, in front of our eyes, like with Andrea Suarez when she's trying to clean up camps, and then these activists like Mutual Aid will come and say, those are people's belongings, that they belong here, right? That's their home. They want a society that looks, they got the society that looks exactly like what their vision of a society should look like.
Yeah. So their idea of society is wildly different than ours, and the two don't really commingle.
Mm-hmm.
So then what are we left with? Look what's happening in San Francisco right now. Sweep after sweep after sweep of homeless encampments. And you know where that's going to get them? Nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. Because where are those people going to go? A couple of blocks over where they're not getting swept. And then the minute the government cleans that out, they're going to go right back. Those are the stories I'm reading right now. That's just reality. Those people need to be in mental institutions and they need to be, put into treatment. But we're not there. We're not going to do that for them. So you've just got a whole crew of people. California has over a third of the United States population homeless. That didn't just happen on accident. People know California is where you go to be homeless.
Right.
So,
and places like Vancouver, Canada, where they have, what's that program they have where they provide you, clean needles and that whole thing.
Yeah.
You're kind of just...
That's harm reduction. Yeah, we do that here. We actually give booty bump kits here. Because when your veins are all tired from shooting heroin, then you put it up your backside and you bypass the gastrointestinal tract.
You're just supplementing people until they die.
Yep. You're enabling people.
And the way I see it, that's no way to treat someone you supposedly love. But I guess, I think we've talked about this before, but you had someone you loved, your son. What were kind of some of the things you tried with him, and what worked and what didn't work? And can we extrapolate from that how we should then treat people on the street?
Yeah, I think some of that is at some point in time, you have to draw a line and say, I don't want anything to do with you. If you're going to be doing drugs the way you are, if you're going to steal from me, if you're going to wreck my car, if you're going to do this, if you're going to do that, here's the hard line. You're an adult. You're making terrible decisions. That's the tough love component. Get them to treatment. If you think they're even close to wanting to go to treatment, get them to treatment. If they need some mental health care, get their state, health insurance going, their free health insurance, whatever it is, get that going. Help them get the mental help that they need so that they can live a decent life. But that's hard to do. And that takes a lot of work. And we've all got lives. And at some point in time, most addicts on the street here, their families have just don't want anything to do with you. I've covered Steve Irwin, who's the guy with the excavator, and he was excavating out the park in Seattle. He was digging for gold. He was mining for gold. He was cutting down trees in a city park. And his family saw one of my live streams with Jeremy Harris of Como and Andrea Suarez. They hadn't seen him in 5 years. They're like, hey, good to know that he's alive, but we don't want him back because until he gets off drugs, he's a liability.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're kind of talking about how what's needed is to force these people into institutions or rehabilitation centers, obviously with compassion, which sounds harsh to force people to do things, but we force people into jail when they murder someone, right? So if people are, even if involuntarily on drugs, being a menace to society, maybe we should, because people say, well, that's just kind of their lifestyle, that's their way of life. But if we wait long enough, they're forcing us to live a certain way. Like, you now go to CVS, I literally have to have a chaperone come with me around the store and, can you unlock the body wash for me? Can you? Yeah. And someone might say, okay, so that's a minor inconvenience you have to go through. How slippery of a slope are you willing to go down? Are you willing to, have your girlfriend harassed on the street with you and people throw cigarettes and trash at you? Are you willing to have, beautiful town centers in your town being taken over. I mean, Lower Queen Anne right here, it's beautiful up here. You go down the hill, you are no longer in a territory that you're welcome in. You're living in someone else's world.
Yeah.
So we have to ask at a certain point, do we force them to go somewhere, or are they going to force us to live a certain way? And I mean, I think it's already happened in certain places.
And that is the big push. That's the big, I think the homeless thing, we allowed that to really take over during the summer of love, 2020, because the far left, that was the summer for the far left, right? I mean, that was their heyday. And so we did no sweeps of encampments. We did nothing. Some of that had to do with the CDC during COVID saying, don't sweep the encampments because it'll spread, the virus. It'll spread COVID, which we ended up finding out that not to be true because they were already living outside. And so, you've just got some crazy stuff going on. And, now we're kind of fighting back the other way. San Francisco being the best example of just doing sweep after sweep after sweep, but it's going to get them nowhere because those people aren't going to give up their addiction because they've been swept 2 blocks down the road.
And I think I really try hard not to sound overly political, and I don't think it should be a political issue. I think it should be a bipartisan issue. You even have people like Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks, if you know them, who gets a lot of hate because she talks about exactly what we're talking about, because she was walking her dog in LA and she was sexually assaulted on the street. 2 guys came over to her, one with an erection, and they just started thrusting at her while she was bending down to pick up its waist.
Yeah.
It's
insane.
Until it affects you. But I'll tell you, I know I'm talking a lot, but like we just deal with this every day. Like an example I saw in one of my Seattle groups that just kind of gives you an insight into some people's mentality. Someone said they were waiting at a stoplight in Northgate, and someone came over and tried to get in their car. They ripped their door open and tried to get in. And so they posted about it in this Facebook group. And then someone in the comments wrote, "Did you ever consider that they might have mistaken you for an Uber?" And there are some people who are just, they're willing to wait till the last second till they have a knife to their throat to be PC about this.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy, right? Yeah. I mean, it kind of goes down to, there's one joke and it says, what is a conservative? It's a liberal that just got mugged. Massive oversimplification.
Right.
But there's something to be said for that because we're allowing all of this to happen. And I see it, they've cleaned up parts of Seattle and then they've just left parts of Seattle. I mean, how about Highway 99 in Seattle? I mean, you've got prostitutes just walking up and down there, literally in their underwear, and we're saying that's okay. We're saying human trafficking is okay, sex trafficking is okay, because we don't want to go after the girls anymore. We want to go after the Johns. We don't have enough cops in Seattle to go after anybody for anything. So we defunded the police, and that was very effective.
So you're talking about the southern border, and the southern border can be, for me at least, when I watch things, it's a frequent talking point of the right wing. Yeah. And we could talk about how real the issue is, and of like that the drugs are coming through there. But I first want to establish your kind of authenticity in the sense of, I was saying like the far left will not acknowledge that this is a drug problem, not a housing problem, right? Would you acknowledge if something politically went against your narrative, right? If, for example, the FBI put crack cocaine in black neighborhoods in the 80s and 90s, if your son was somehow affected by that, would you acknowledge that it wasn't from the southern border, that maybe it came from Canada or it came from the FBI or something that went against your agenda?
Yeah. I mean, and you know what? We used to have people just die of overdoses of heroin, and so whether you die of that, it's kind of like dead is dead. So whether it comes across the southern border or not, but there's been such a prevalence of the southern border. We just know it. We know it to be true. And the gangs that are here now, Tren de Aragua, I mean, the vicious Venezuelan gang, we know that they're operating. They've taken over an entire complex in Denver. I talk about that. So the narrative of the southern border, it is what it is. My son just got caught up in it.
Right.
You know? And if it was something different, I would say, well, whatever that might have been. And I don't blame the wide open southern border on my son being dead, but it certainly didn't help.
Certainly an issue.
Yeah.
Let's wait for this
Yeah.
to pass. The reason I bring that up is I think it's important to establish for people of all backgrounds, political backgrounds watching this, that we're not saying this stuff with any agenda. We care about the issues affecting Americans, affecting human beings, and where they come from. And wherever they come from, we're willing to admit that. Whereas I think when we talk about the extremes, and in the case of Seattle and other cities like it, the far left, they're simply not willing to just say that something was someone's fault or that something came from a certain place, and it's very frustrating to not be able to talk about that.
And I think it's because they would need to admit that their ideology may have some flaws in it.
Right.
One of the things that I think Republicans are wrong on, or it does not help them, is the whole abortion issue. I'm not in favor of everybody getting an abortion, but I think women should be able to make their own choice. Period. And
even no limits, even till the last month.
I struggle with that. I don't really, I'm a dude. You know what I mean? And if I had a daughter and she got raped, what would that look like? I think people should be able to have a choice, and I don't think outlawing it on a national level. I think the way it is now with states being able to make that choice, you're always going to be able to get one. And I'm okay with that. If that's what you want to go out and do, then all right. And that's where I would probably differ from a lot of Republicans. I would certainly differ from most Christians. That's a whole nother world, is that you're committing murder, you're murdering babies.
It's funny because I'm probably more conservative than you on that issue. I mean, I'm with you. I think if I had a daughter, I would help her do what I felt was best for her life. I obviously have limits to that. I think my limit is when the nervous system develops, because I think, sentience and all that. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tricky issue that no one has a great answer for, or an absolute answer for, unless you are religious, which I'm not. But yeah, so it's interesting that you differ from Republicans or the right on that. So I think it's worth asking, what is the source of your conservatism, or you say you're not necessarily conservative, but your right-leaning views? Where do you think that derives from for you?
Whenever I'm asked that, I go back to what I know, which is real estate. Hey, if you got a nice neighborhood, decent looking neighborhood, and you don't have a bunch of nut jobs running around, and you don't have a bunch of homeless people, it's easier to sell homes there. It's easier to raise children there. It's easier to do everything there because it just kind of works. The neighborhoods we have here, Portland, good example. They've got neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood where people can't sell their homes, where they're trying to get out because they don't want their kids to have to walk past, some guy with his pants at his ankles who's taken a poop in them last night because he's all whacked out on drugs. They don't want their kids to have to deal with that. So what is reasonable for society? And to me, it's, when you get to these neighborhoods, they don't tolerate that kind of thing. They're better off. They're more well-run. They have better leadership. And those are typically, you don't find those in far left neighborhoods. You do not find neighborhoods like that where you've got a bunch of far left extremists and everything runs well.
Right. I think you can find that in a center left neighborhood like we're in right now, where people have money and they have property and kids they care about. But when you have a neighborhood basically of transients, like I would say more downtown Cap Hill, where it's people who are renting 1 year at a time, they don't care about the beautician of the neighborhood. That tends to happen.
So for me, as a real estate broker, homogeneity, meaning everything is kind of the same, vanilla, the exact opposite of what the far left wants. They want everybody to be an individual and have their own, whatever. No borders, no law, no nothing. Let's just let her rip and we'll see what happens. Well, we've seen what happens, in CHOP. 2 black kids got murdered, and they got shut down by the cops. Horrific stuff.
Yeah.
So we've literally watched that happen, and it didn't turn out well. So, and, I was there live streaming, and it was like, where are we? What third world country are we in?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you kind of choosing your battles, right? Like saying, hey, I don't need to be conservative across the board. There are these core things that I care about and make sense to me. But let's say the abortion thing doesn't make as much sense to me. Because there are obviously Republicans in politics who virtue signal about human life and a baby's life. But I bet you if, just like an extreme example, but plausible, I guess, if they cheated on their wife, right, with like a prostitute and knocked someone up, I bet you they would cover that up with an abortion.
Yep.
A lot of them. Some of them obviously wouldn't, but a lot of them would. So I think it's important to have people like yourself who will call it like you see it, from issue to issue, because the problem I have with YouTube and thumbnails, whether you're anti this or pro this, everyone just hammers on the same point of view over and over again. And they're just kind of a walking talking point. They're not.
It's rhetoric.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't believe in abortion. I've had, 2 beautiful children born. I've watched them come out of my wife, and it was an amazing experience. And I can't imagine even, taking a life of a fetus that's however old. I can't imagine doing that. But I think at the end of the day, people need to make their own choice. And especially, it's all guys that run the government and make all the laws, right? So that's a very female-oriented issue. And I don't feel like men should be dictating that. People with that equipment that can have babies, they should probably make those decisions. It's kind of more how I feel. Instead of me, oh, no, we can't do that. Oh, no, that's wrong. Yeah. Says it in the Bible, therefore.
Who knew you were a closeted feminist?
Yeah.
So getting back to the drug issue and, talking about the southern border, can you tell me about that? Because I've also heard of, fentanyl being manufactured in China, in places in Europe. Like, why is it coming through the southern border and, let's say, not the northern border, or not, in cargo from the
Because the Mexican
ocean?
cartels aren't in Canada. Mexican cartels and all the cartels running South America, Central America, are just running drugs, And the cartels used to just run drugs. Now they run people. Darien Gap in between Panama and Colombia, I think it is.
Colombia, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to shut that down. I mean, Doctors Without Borders were there, and they released a report in February, and there's 14 women they know on average every day were being sexually assaulted. They were being just raped going through the Darien Gap.
Don't drugs come from other places, though, aside from just the cartels? Like, aren't drugs produced in Europe? There are drugs in Europe.
Yeah, but so it's gangs that run them, right? So you've got gangs running wide open through the southern border here. Why wouldn't they? You're going to have the occasional drug bust coming through the northern border, but between United States and Canada, we're both on board that drugs are a problem. Mexico, not as much. Colombia, not as much. Venezuela, where all these countries where these folks are coming from, they are escaping violence, and a number of them bring violence here. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to talk about clearly. It's starting to become a bipartisan issue because people say go down to the border, you'll see it for yourself how many people are crossing. Obviously, New York is overwhelmed with that situation. I think what's hard is growing up, especially I grew up in the New York, New Jersey area. You're just surrounded by probably illegal immigrants, and most of them that you see and meet look like the hardest working people you've ever seen. Like, I was never surrounded by people I felt like, oh, that guy's definitely in a gang, right? Is that different in Texas, or like what? It's kind of hard to discern.
Well, they don't want to be in Texas because your odds, the closer you are to the border, your odds of being deported are higher. And when you've got a Republican governor like Greg Abbott, who has really laid down the law in Texas. So I went down to the border. I went down to Eagle Pass twice to see how things were going. And it was nuts to know how many people were literally just streaming across the border. It was, 302,000 came through in the month of December, January 2023. 300,000 people went through, not a huge area, just boom, into the United States.
But how does I'm asking from a really naive perspective, how does this work in the sense of, this is on camera, everyone knows it's happening.
Yep.
We have laws in the country.
Yeah.
So why isn't anyone stopping it? Like what's the deal with that?
Because the Biden administration wanted to appease their far left, and they said, let's go, let's go, let's go. Let's have compassion for these people. We're going to treat them all as if they are seeking political asylum. We'll bring them in. We'll give them a court date for their first hearing down the road. It might be 2029. And then we'll use a system called parole, and we'll allow them to go into the United States. And now we'll give them work visas.
And that's not an exaggeration. Because, for example, people on the right would say things like, oh, Obama, he loves illegal. And then he deported more people than any other president ever. You're saying that's different with Biden?
Oh, he's immediately day one, he stopped building the wall. Mm-hmm. He's had 94 executive decisions where he's basically undone what Trump did. Trump, we had 40-year lows coming into the country.
But we had border security before Trump's whole wall thing.
Oh, we've always had border security.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Trump knew what was coming through, and he said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to build the wall. Mm-hmm. Everybody made fun of him. Now what are we doing? We're building the wall because it bit Biden in the ass. All these people coming through, everybody's pointing at it. You got all kinds of crime going up. And when Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, started busing people to the Democratic sanctuary cities, the self-described Democratic sanctuary cities, it turned the table on the whole thing. Now Chicago's got to deal with it. Now Washington, D.C.'s got to deal with it. Now New York City's got to deal with it. Now Denver's got to deal with it. Seattle's got to deal with it. And we've all got affordable housing issues. Chicago, not as much. But there's nowhere for those folks to go. And so millions of dollars are being spent when they should be going to people here that we need to take care of.
Yeah, I sense this increasingly becoming a bipartisan issue because it's becoming so overwhelming. But it is funny that it's always been viewed as a right-wing point to call for borders, when some of the countries that people, democratic socialists, let's say, love the most, the Scandinavian countries, they've become some of the strictest on the border. Denmark, for example.
Yeah.
Denmark is insane.
Yeah.
What they make refugees go through.
Yeah. And most of the time you can't come into the country. You can come into the country once you're all fully approved. We're doing the opposite. We're dumping millions and millions and millions of people into the country and then working it out later. And then you wonder why you've got a certain percentage of those are, bad hombres.
And you're obviously a compassionate person, and I'm sure you've met people who might be illegal immigrant. I mean, someone,
sure,
working in the kitchen at a restaurant, whatever, and you can tell when someone's a good person.
Yeah. When
they came here, they were just trying to escape a bad situation. Are you kind of like a tough love hardliner, like too bad, illegal, get out? Or where do you lie in that spectrum?
There's got to be a process to vet who's coming into the country. We have allowed how many, straight up felon criminals, how many gang members into the country? How many have we let in? I mean, we've literally got gangs running here now. We've got major gangs all up and down the West Coast. They're all on the East Coast because they've been allowed in. And they won't get deported in sanctuary cities because sanctuary cities, part of their virtue signaling is we will not work with ICE. We will not work with deporting anybody because that would be wrong. So now we're kind of stuck with this whole deal where we've got all these people, we've got to fund them. Denver being the most recent example, they are literally going down to the southern border and telling everybody, don't come to Denver because we're all out of space. Chicago doing the same thing. Don't come to Chicago. We don't have any more room for you. And, it's not very compassionate.
Mm-hmm. The last thing I want to talk about is legalization of drugs. I imagine you're someone who supports the legalization of weed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, people said that the legalization of weed would destroy the marijuana cartel. It would make it so that people got cleaner drugs. They wouldn't be laced with things. It was safer. And I think what a lot of people are arguing now that somehow the cartel is stronger than ever. What do you think is behind that? Like, do you regret that decision to legalize, or what do you think about that?
No, because I think the tax revenue dollars are being used to put people in treatment. There's some good and there's some bad. Drugs that kill you. I mean, how many people have died in the last 10,000 years from marijuana overdose?
But I think people would argue that because weed's legal now and, people with a party lifestyle, they're not like, oh, where can you score me some weed? They're going to harder stuff now. Is that a valid point?
I don't think so. I do not buy that, because I know plenty of people that have done weed and booze and they call it good, and they don't go, you know what? Today I'm going to do a little crack. I'm just going to experiment with crack. I don't think that's a thing. You know what I mean?
It's not that they're necessarily saying, oh, I love weed, I'm sure I'd love meth. It's more that kids, when you're young and you're in college or whatever, everyone's always trying to get something illicit and rebellious and kind of edgy. And they're like, oh, what do you got for me? I'm just kind of spelling out what it might look like.
I put weed in a category the same as booze, and booze kills literally millions of people, right? Cirrhosis of the liver. Weed doesn't kill anybody. So I'm okay with weed. Booze, I mean, you got to make your own choice.
No, I'm talking about it's shifting things more,
to accepting drugs.
Yeah. Now weed is like, right. People at parties would say, okay, all this alcohol is great, but you got any weed for me? Now they're like, okay, this weed's great and all of it. You got any, harder stuff?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I don't think it's because weed is legal.
Uh-huh.
I really don't.
Okay. And what do you think is the cutoff? Like, what is your sort of principle on legality of drugs? What should be and what shouldn't be?
If it can kill you, if a single dose can kill you, I'm a no-go. Leave it to the doctors.
So cocaine?
Out.
LSD?
Out.
That can kill you?
I mean, it can make you go crazy, right? We know that. Microdosing, a different story. Microdosing under a doctor's order, okay. But people are doing a lot of weed under doctor's orders as well. So, I see the health benefits of weed. Can it be a slippery slope? You smoke too much weed and your life goes off track? Absolutely. You drink too many beers? Yeah, you can go off track as well. But I think, most of those drugs, I'm going to say I'm a no.
Rounding out this discussion, bringing it back to home, about your son and how the reality of the issue of drugs and addiction society reached him and reached you by proxy. Is there any advice that you have for other parents, either who are worried that their kids might get introduced to certain things or are already dealing with it?
I would say be brutally honest. Make yourself aware that any drug out there that isn't coming from a doctor could kill them. Make them totally aware. Hey, even if it's one line of blow, that could kill you. It's happening to people. If you don't know where the weed is coming from, their cartel is lacing that as well. Mm-hmm. So they're lacing everything because it makes sense, because it's so cheap. Why wouldn't they? So I would say brutal honesty with the kids. They're probably going to do it. I mean, odds are, right? Kids experiment. Not all kids, but mine certainly did. Have that talk with them and let them know these are the consequences of your actions. Because there's so many kids who I think, are experimenting for the first time, and their body doesn't have any resistance to fentanyl, and it's just killing them.
Yeah, you hear about those.
Yeah. And it used to be, good Lord, I can't believe my kid's on heroin. But now I think, sure wish my kid was only on heroin. That's the crazy part about it. I don't want to see my kid OD on heroin.
Yeah.
But it's not heroin anymore. It's fentanyl. And, so I keep Narcan around just in case, somebody around me ODs, I'll up their nose.
Yeah. It's kind of symbolic in a way of where our country, our culture, our technology, social media is going. We need a stronger and stronger high.
I would not disagree with that.
Yeah.
So you just gotta know your boundaries. Teach your kids by example. Because how many kids start using because their parents have it at home?
I never got into drugs, unless you count alcohol. But I guess I never got into drugs because I was really scared off by it. I mean, simply my parents said from a young age, smoking is bad. My grandfather died of lung cancer, not related to smoking, but I'm like, I don't want lung cancer.
He just got lung cancer and died.
He just got it.
Yeah.
But that was enough for me to think, I don't want to deal with any of that stuff. But there is a scenario in which you do what my parents did for me, and the kid, because they were told not to do it, rebels, and their parents are too conservative, and then they do it. So what is like the fine line there of how to prime your kids and prep them for that?
I think, they got to know that you love them. You give them as good advice as you can. You get them raised up. You give them as many opportunities as you can afford to. And then it's up to them to make the right decision. And you can't, as a parent, you can only control so much. Don't be a murderer. Don't do this. Don't do that. There's only so much you can do. And you got to point them in that right direction. And then there's sometimes where the odds just go against you and something goes sideways and, you end up with a dead son.
Well, yeah, I don't know how to end that on a happy note.
There's no ending on a happy note. But that is the hardcore reality, and that's part of why we're doing this, is to give the message that you do the best you can as a parent. And then, whatever happens after that, and that's something I'll have to live with the rest of my life. Don't get to see my 27-year-old son grow up. Don't get to have grandkids from him. Don't get to have all that. But do the best you can, and that's all you can do.
Yeah.
Because everything else is outside of your control. So it's not a good answer. It's not an easy answer.
No.
And it's not the answer people want to hear.
Well, even though we can't end on a happy note for you, I'm sure this conversation and your story will be invaluable to a lot of people and preventative for their children. And so they'll have that happy note. And, Yeah,
if it can help a few people, maybe get into treatment, maybe help their parents realize, maybe they could die. Let's work on getting them into treatment. If that helps people, I'm totally for it. Yeah. I'm totally for it. Because my son's dead. He ain't coming back. But somebody else's kid could be saved. And so that's important. That's important. That's the important part.
Exactly. You can only look for positives from here on. That's the only thing I guess you can do. And obviously be realistic about what occurred. But
yeah. Is your glass half full or is it half empty?
Right.
I try to believe my glass is half full. So.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate you talking about it, being vulnerable about it. I personally know other people through people who are still in the strong addiction phases and have not succumbed to it yet, though come close. So I will say that me and many people watching, it's going to help. It helps hearing about it. So
yeah, just knowing what's out there, knowing what's going on, because I think society just wants to bury it and go, everything's good, everything's fine. And then you have 110,000 people die a year of overdoses. It's like, okay, not everything is fine. And when it hits home, when it's one of your children, that's when you're like, oof, yeah, this is not good. No,
it's real life. A lot of things that we see on the news and we're like, oh, the news is trying to scare you. Some things are like that. And then other things, it comes to you and you're like, it's real life. And that's why people are talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, I appreciate you coming here to talk about it.
You bet.
Great conversation.
Hey, Hood. Yeah. I enjoy the interview. I hope your channel keeps doing crazy things and moving forward, you do really well.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll help this video blow up. So
We'll see. Thanks, Ehud. Thank you. Yep.